In high corridors, where the air seems frozen by the weight of centuries, a silence is kept that is louder than any scream. Imagine a place where dust dances in the rays of light filtering through stained glass windows, but this light never reaches the darkest corners. We are not just in a library or an archive. We stand on the threshold of the greatest mystery, hidden behind velvet draperies and gilded seals. This is a story of how the quest to comprehend the divine plan led to actions that make a modern person's blood run cold. Here, among ancient manuscripts, lie reports written not in ink, but in human suffering. Reports of how the scalpel attempted to find the soul within the perishable body. The history of medicine and the history of religion are intertwined far more closely than is commonly accepted in official textbooks. For centuries, the Church held a monopoly not only on the salvation of the soul, but also on the healing of the body. Hospitals, infirmaries, asylums for the insane, all were under the strict control of the clergy. In this boundless influence lies the root of our current investigation. When one institution possesses complete power over a person's physical shell and simultaneously over their post-mortem fate, the boundaries of what is permissible begin to blur. The question, is it permissible to inflict suffering for the sake of a higher good, ceases to be theoretical and moves into a practical plane, where the answer becomes the closed doors of monastic infirmaries. Delving into the depths of centuries, we discover an astonishing paradox. Officially, the Church forbade the shedding of blood and the dissection of bodies, considering it a desecration of the temple of the soul. However, there is a vast difference between what was proclaimed from the pulpit to the common flock and what transpired in closed laboratories, accessible only to the chosen few. The Renaissance, which we are accustomed to celebrating as a time of flourishing arts and humanism, had its shadowy side. The great anatomists of that era, whose names are known to every schoolchild, often worked not against the Church, but under its tacit patronage, yet with one condition. The results of their investigations, if they contradicted dogmas, had to disappear. But anatomy was only the first step. Far darker secrets are hidden in the history of the search for the physical location of the soul. In the 16th and 17th centuries, within closed circles of Vatican scholars, the idea arose that the divine spark could be found, measured, and even, possibly, controlled. This was a time when medicine balanced on the brink of alchemy and theology. There is scattered evidence of procedures performed on people on the verge of death. The purpose of these manipulations was not to save the dying, but an attempt to capture the moment when the soul leaves the body. In the basements of ancient hospitals, under the cover of night, experiments were conducted to weigh, measure energy fields, and attempt to visualize the invisible. The bodies of paupers, who had no relatives, became expendable material in this race for metaphysical knowledge. One of the most obvious and tragic examples of the interference of religious dogmas in human physiology was the practice of creating angelic voices. We are talking about a phenomenon that lasted for centuries and cost the health of thousands of boys. Operations performed for the sake of preserving a high voice were not just barbarism. It was a systematic, well-oiled medical industry that existed with the tacit and sometimes explicit approval of the higher clergy. This is the clearest example of how human nature was violently altered to satisfy aesthetic and religious requirements. Surgical intervention here acted as a tool to create an artificial angel, a being that belongs neither to the world of men nor to the world of women, but serves as a living instrument for the glorification of heaven. But if castrati were the visible, singing part of this system, then what happened within the walls of asylums for the mentally ill remained a seven-sealed secret. Until the mid-20th century, the line between possession and mental illness was extremely thin, and this line was often drawn not by doctors, but by priests. A person whose behavior deviated from the norm fell into the millstones of a system where treatment more resembled sophisticated punishment. In the archives, one can find mentions of methods of exorcising darkness through physical impact, icy water, prolonged isolation in complete darkness, the use of mechanisms for rotating the body until loss of consciousness. All of this was presented as ways to shock the demon, to force it to leave its vessel. But in essence, these were early, cruel experiments on the human psyche, attempts to rewrite personality through suffering. Particularly troubling is the period when the Church faced the challenges of the 19th century scientific revolution. Instead of retreating, some orders decided to use science to confirm miracles. Observations of stigmata and ecstatic states were conducted in closed asylums. But was this passive observation? A number of researchers believe that in an effort to prove divine presence, experiments were conducted to artificially induce these states. The use of certain chemical compounds, fasting, and hypnotic techniques were applied to nuns and novices to induce visions, which were then interpreted as revelations. This was a dangerous dance on the edge of pharmacology and mysticism, where the human mind was subjected to colossal overloads for the sake of obtaining proofs of faith. Moving closer to our century, we encounter an even more complex ethical dilemma. The colonial era opened up vast territories and populations who were completely disenfranchised to missionary medicine. In remote missions in Africa and South America, far from the oversight of European commissions, medical aid often went hand in hand with medical data collection. Vaccination with new drugs and testing of treatments for tropical diseases were often carried out on local populations without any informed consent. People who came for salvation and the Word of God unwittingly became participants in clinical trials. The argument was always the same: sacrifice the few for the good of the many. But somehow, the few always turned out to be those whose voices were not heard in high offices. There is also a layer of information concerning the so-called Magdalene asylums and similar institutions around the world. For a long time, it was believed that these were merely correctional facilities, but recent findings force us to look at them from a different angle. The discovery of mass graves on the territories of former church asylums in Ireland and Canada caused a shock. But beyond the very fact of neglect of lives, questions arise about the reasons for such a high mortality rate in these places. Was it only diseases and poor nutrition? Or were these closed ecosystems used to study the limits of human endurance, the effects of new drugs on weakened organisms? Some documents indicate that pharmaceutical companies in the mid-20th century had contracts with institutions managed by religious orders to test vaccines and psychotropic substances on children and women who were completely dependent on the system. In this context, the figure of a doctor in a cassock acquires an ominous hue. The internal conflict of such a person is colossal. On one hand, the Hippocratic Oath; on the other, a vow of obedience. When the abbot's command contradicts medical ethics, which prevails? History shows that hierarchy often triumphed over humanism. A doctor who believes they are saving a soul can justify any actions upon the body. Pain becomes a tool of purification, and the side effects of an experiment become a test of faith. This terrible logic allowed for actions that, in the secular world, would be immediately condemned as a crime. Another facet of this dark prism is the question of genetics and blood. Vatican archives are rumored to hold genealogical trees tracing back to biblical times. But in the 20th century, interest in blood ceased to be purely archival. Theories suggest that during certain periods, biological material was collected under the guise of routine medical analyses in church hospitals. The goal was to track specific genetic lines or to find anomalies that could be interpreted as signs of chosenness or, conversely, of a curse. This sounds like the plot of a science fiction novel, but if one recalls the obsession with blood purity in different historical periods, such an interest from the world's oldest organization does not seem so incredible. The transformation of approaches occurred only in the second half of the 20th century, when the world changed irreversibly. Transparency, the emergence of international human rights organizations, and the development of secular bioethics forced the Vatican to reconsider its positions. Many archives were closed even more tightly, and the rhetoric shifted to a distinctly humanistic tone. However, the past does not disappear without a trace. It remains in medical records that were never given to relatives, in nameless graves with inventory numbers instead of names, in the memories of those who went through the system of closed institutions and survived. The complexity of the situation is compounded by the fact that many of these experiments and practices were not a centralized, villainous plan of one person. It was a systemic error, born of the conviction of one's own infallibility. When an organization considers itself the sole conduit of truth, any of its actions, even the cruelest, automatically receive justification by a higher purpose. This is the philosophical dead end. Evil committed with the conviction of absolute good. Researchers who tried to shed light on these events often encountered a wall of silence that had been built for centuries. Documents were moved, witnesses were silenced, and facts were declared anti-clerical propaganda. The culmination of this historical investigation is a realization of scale. We are not talking about isolated incidents, but about a philosophy of treating a person as a vessel that can be broken to see what's inside, or remolded at will. Whether it was castrati in the 17th century, the possessed in the 19th, or orphans in the 20th, all were victims of the same idea. Physical existence is secondary to dogma. The body is merely clay, and the Church reserved the right to be the sculptor, even if it meant cutting off living flesh. Today, we live in a world where bioethics has become a rigorous science. We discuss the rights of embryos, cloning, and artificial intelligence. The Vatican actively participates in these discussions, often taking a stance in defense of human dignity. And there is a bitter irony in this. An organization that for centuries conducted experiments on human nature now stands guard over its inviolability. Perhaps this is a form of atonement? Or simply a change of tactics in a world where secrets become apparent too quickly? The lessons we can draw from this dark chronicle are universal. They concern not only religion, but any ideology that places an idea above a specific human life. As soon as we begin to justify the suffering of one person for the good of all humanity or a higher purpose, we open the door to that very laboratory where the doctor turns into an inquisitor. The danger lies not in the pursuit of knowledge, but in the lack of control and transparency. A monopoly on truth always leads to abuse, whether within the walls of a laboratory or under the arches of a cathedral. Concluding our journey through the labyrinths of forgotten history, we again find ourselves before the closed doors of the archive. We know only a small part of what is hidden behind them. Thousands of pages, written in the neat handwriting of monastic chroniclers, are still waiting for their time. But even what we know is enough to understand. The path to light sometimes passed through unimaginable darkness. The history of the medical secrets of the Vatican is a reminder of how fragile a human being is in the face of a vast system, and how important it is to preserve the memory of those whose voices were silenced for the sake of higher harmony. These shadows of the past should not frighten us. They should serve as a warning, for history tends to repeat itself where its lessons have been forgotten, and truth has been sacrificed to convenient silence. The silence of the archives is deceptive. If you listen closely, you can hear the echo of the steps of those who sought the soul but lost their humanity.